Welcome to Small Pleasures, the podcast that discusses great short stories and greatness in the short story form. My name is Livi Michael, and I'm a novelist and short story writer from Manchester, England. And this is Sonya Moor, a short story writer and translator from Paris, France.
Bonjour.
We've come together because of a mutual enthusiasm for the short story, although I think our responses and what we want from a short story vary, and we hope that the differences will provide a fruitful discussion.
This time we're delighted to welcome a very special guest, Tom Conaghan, who's going to discuss his admirable contribution to short fiction.
Hello, everybody.
Tom's the editor and publisher of Scratch Books and of the excellent website associated with it, where he runs a competition for flash fiction and hosts a Scratch Classics page featuring contributions from contemporary writers who write about their favourite classic story, which is a marvellous way to be introduced to some classic short fiction. His reviews and essays have appeared in many places, including The Observer, The Times Literary Supplement, The Irish Times, and the LA Review of Books. So, Tom, you've dedicated yourself in various ways to short fiction as editor, judge, and publisher, although your background, I believe, is in the more commercial aspects of publishing and marketing. Would you like to talk a little about the journey from the commercial to the literary aspects of fiction, and what drew you to short fiction in particular, which is usually considered to be less commercial?
I think it's probably about how it was viewed as less commercial and therefore of less value. And so I wanted to make sure that short fiction had enough oxygen, that it was really given enough room and love for people to kind of understand what a great art it is. It is in our country not as commercially exciting, I think, to the sort of the large publishing houses, but that's completely contingent. There's nothing necessary about that at all. And I wanted to just do what I could to be a cheerleader for it. I worked with Kathy Galvin at the Word Factory, who's a superb proponent of the short story. And I wanted to see what I could do there and bring sort of the little I knew from my background and other aspects of publishing around it. And it's been really fun. And we're trying to kind of change the landscape minutely, bit by bit. And I think we are. I know that novelists whisper in my ear, I'm writing a short story now, knowing that they can't tell their agent that. It's been a really exciting and really interesting expedition. And it's lovely, all the sort of people who come on board and people who are also along for the journey.
Well, that really touches on a subject that's really close to both our hearts, the fact that it is regarded as in some way a lesser form, whereas I think we both personally find that the greatest fiction is often in the short form. But I think what I'm really asking is, when did you first develop an enthusiasm for it? Was it at university or before?
I think it started with a large collection of Nabokov's short stories, who's probably not known for short fiction, but there was just something absolutely pyrotechnic about his writing in these sort of short little bursts. I don't think I was fully aware of the incredible craft and work with the conscious and the unconscious there, but I think I was blown away. And then, of course, we came, Raymond Carver and going back through Chekhov and stuff. And again, there was something different from the 300-page novel, something I felt more like a shot of vodka as opposed to, the longer drink. It was much more exhilarating, I found.
That resonates with me, that intensity that you can find in short fiction. It's not something that I personally find in any other prose form.
It's a great comparison, yes. Was that at university?
I don't know. No, I think it was in my early 20s. I don't think I really came of age until very recently, until my early 40s.
No, that's right. I was even later, really, when I got switched on to short stories. I think that's interesting in itself. But sorry, Sonya, I'm interrupting you.
That's a great interruption. It's always interesting to know when people meet with short fiction. Yeah. For me, it was school, and it was a Mansfield story. And that was revelatory as well, that you could find such intensity. Something could happen in this very small space that wasn't happening anywhere else, as far as I could see.
So I am actually also an English teacher. And I think because I just didn't get school at all, I didn't get the texts we were meant to read. And I think it was because anything that was just sort of slapped on your desk from a teacher was work. And it wasn't reading or literature. And so I think it's taken me a very, very long time to get all the way around to enjoying stories.
It's brilliant that you're making the space for short fiction. You started Scratchbooks about a couple of years ago and have already published a fabulous selection of anthologies, collections, and collaboration. The Poet and the Echo, for instance, based on the BBC Radio 4 series in which short fiction writers respond to works of poetry. Or in the case of Reverse Engineering, an anthology featuring stories accompanied by interviews with the authors. What draws you to combining different forms in this way?
I think this is maybe more of a commercial element in that I know that a book of short stories won't necessarily get a review in a national paper unless there's an interesting twist on it, unless there's, really fantastic celebrated authors doing something a little bit different. And so you've got to go big. You've got to make a bit of a song and dance if you want the world to kind of go, oh, that's an interesting idea. And because short story publishing has been left alone, any idea seems immediately quite a good idea. There's something we're doing in the autumn called Duets, where we're getting short story writers to write a story back and forth. And people have been going, been really, really excited about it. And it's like, oh, that's only the first of a few ideas of ours. So yeah, it's exciting, but you got to do the song and dance for people to go, oh, short stories.
The Reverse Engineering books were your first, I think, and for those of you who don't know, there are 2 volumes, each containing 7 stories by well-known writers, who then discuss the inspiration and decisions behind their stories in an interview with Tom. I should just say that it is a great resource for anyone writing or teaching short stories. But can you say how you came up with this particular idea?
I was working at the Word Factory with Kathy Galvin, and she wanted me to do a series of interviews. As a fledgling short story writer, I was trying to get my head around how these incredible short stories, they seem to have such freedom. They seem to have no reliance on form at all. They could just be absolutely what they were. And I wanted to go after these writers and get them in a headlock and say, how did you get away with this? How dare you to go in this direction and then leave it behind, because what the story were about was not the content of the story. They seem to be working on other levels. And whenever you hear the New Yorker interviews, when one writer talks about another writer's fiction, the sort of the greatest compliment they can pay it is they always say, I don't know how that writer did it. And I think that's rather exciting about the short story, that it is this literary antimatter and you can't quite get your head around it. And I wanted to get the writers, in a vice and, kind of just beat the answers out of them.
Tom, that is another great phrase, the literary antimatter. I love that in the short story because it often is something that you can't quite pin down that makes the story absolutely sing or fly. And that's interesting to know that really it was your own curiosity about how these stories work that kind of propelled you into this project. The stories have all been published previously, I think. How difficult was it to secure permission to reprint them?
Variously difficult. All the authors were fantastic at all times, really making sure that I was well looked after. And necessarily, agents do a fantastic job in making sure that, the authors are well paid. We were working from a position of not having a lot of money, but getting after it. And so eventually all the ducks came into a row, and it was a great day when we heard that, this or that person had agreed to it. And actually people were very kind to allow permission to the stories, even though it was a very long operation. Permissions department, they must have a great backlog because they do take a while.
I just thought of it because at one point I tried to get permission to quote from something and the obstacles were quite, astounding. Were there any that you ended up kind of rejecting because you just couldn't get permission?
I'm I'm a little bit dogmatic actually. So usually people kind of, just in order to get me out of their inbox, kind of eventually agrees. It's just like they find a way.
Did you liaise with the authors about your questions, about your interviews first? Was there a kind of toing and froing? Did they kind of agree to certain questions and not others, or, were the ones they wanted to answer?
I always offered the authors the opportunity to look at the questions beforehand. And I sort of got a sense that some did and were quite well prepared. Other people like Tessa Hadley and Tom Drury, who I think this is how they write, they didn't want to see them, and Ronan Hession as well, they didn't want to see them beforehand. They wanted to answer them as they write, which is purely from instinct. They wanted to just be there in the moment answering the question.
That's fascinating to hear that Tessa Hadley writes that way, because her stories seem so very deliberate.
I put it to Tessa Hadley that I felt with some of her characters, she's surprised by them. You can see her sort of coming to her characters on the page in that she doesn't form them from the outside. She doesn't give you their character. She kind of watches them on the page, it feels.
Yeah, there's certainly a sense of that as a reader. I'm often surprised by what they do.
Yeah, she says she just works very, very slowly. And I think that's how she gets that definition that you mentioned, Sonya. She just gets it right, gets that sentence right. And she doesn't really redraft. She says there's no point to doing it better later, just doing it now in the moment, getting it just right.
That's fascinating. I'd be interested to hear about your process for composing your anthologies in terms of choosing and ordering the stories, what considerations you juggle, how you yourself read, whether you read cover to cover or cherry picking.
Right. As a reader, I will read cover to cover. There's probably some element of self-hatred in that. I will get through books that I'm not really enjoying just to get to the end, just so I don't have to read that bastard again. In the choosing of the stories, it's just I wanted the stories that have intrigued me over the years, stories that have really haunted and lingered with me. What an opportunity to talk to the author about something that has been on my mind for years. So there's a brilliant Joseph O'Neill story I was over the moon to get the chance to talk to him about, because it had just literally been hanging over me for that long. When it comes to putting together the anthologies, people have asked me this before, and I think this is probably quite a weak answer. I don't quite know. It feels a little bit instinctive in that I will have a rough go at the order, and that's usually it. That's usually like, oh, that works. And maybe there's something a little bit instinctive about keeping an energy going. I'm about to work on a book that was published in Korean, and it's a fantastic book of short stories, but I think the order of the stories are wrong. So I'm going to have to go back to the Korean publisher and the author and say, can I rearrange this? It doesn't get the energy. You don't leave the book feeling that it's still imbued in you. It actually tails out. And so with a story that's maybe slightly tails off like that, the anti-penultimate story would be good for that one. You're left with the story, with the book still fired within you.
That's such a good answer, actually. It's not quite the one I thought you would give, because, but I like it. I like that answer. The stories all seem varied. I thought you'd maybe chosen, obviously they're varied, but there's kind of variation of genre, type of story within there.
I think that was the decision, but it wasn't arrived at with a ruler and a calculator. I think it was just like, let's do this one, then this one. So yeah, there was an initial thought, but I was surprised how little thought it took. Maybe that's the story of scratch books, much less thought than you would imagine.
Lovely. Well, today we're talking in particular about Reverse Engineering 1, which features stories by Jessie Greengrass, Sarah Hall, John McGregor, Irinison Okoje, Joseph O'Neill, Chris Power, and Mahreen Sohail. And you've chosen to discuss Hair by Mahreen Sohail in more detail. Can you say why you chose this story and perhaps tell our listeners what it's about? I chose it because it's a very, very powerful story for me. I still remember exactly where and when I read it. It was a Saturday evening while the kids were in bed and my wife's having a drink out the back. I'm having a drink out the front with the last of the evening sun. I'll find a really good short story and save it for Saturday evening. And one of those was Hair by Mahreen. It's about a wig. It's about the relationship between four people, a young boy, a young girl, and the boy's parents. But then it rolls on, it becomes about something greater, something deeper, something richer. And probably even if we were sitting to talk for an hour, we would find more and more things it was about. So sort of multifarious is it as a superb short story. And I think maybe I'm a huge fan of Mahreen's as well. And maybe she is of the authors in that collection, probably the least celebrated in the UK at the moment. So it was a chance to talk about that as well. Yes, it's lovely that you do that. There are some very well-known writers and some less well-known writers in the collection. And the story certainly takes an unusual form, moving between different characters and generations. The use of symbolism is quite fluid and wide-ranging, but there is a dramatic structure and the central dramatic action is quite violent, isn't it? What do you think precipitates this violence? It's very violent. It's a mutilation in proxy, this boy's cutting of his girlfriend's hair. I think it comes from the boy's lack of purpose. He's coming of age. He knows it's his time to do something, but he lacks the bravery and the creativity to actually take a proper action of himself. He sees his girlfriend who's going through the same stage, but she's magnificent. She's experimental. She's dynamic. She has this great creativity. And next to her, he sees he's convictionless and he's sort of almost empty. He's not as strong as her. And so
I think he's drawn to violence, therefore, because there's this fantastic irony in the story that the moment that she cuts her hair in order to please him is the moment, with this great pledging of herself to him, that she begins to disgust him. And this irony, which is magnificent for us as the reader, is too much for him. And so I think he's drawn to violence. And in that sort of stupid way that violent people are, that he's justified it as kind of, she started it, she's cut her own hair, she's thrown the status quo, and he's trying to keep up and he's trying to respond. And I think the other thing that's conditioned this great violence and is not mentioned in the story is society. Society is behind this. It has this great oppressive normativity, and it makes everyone in the story very, very anxious. And you can feel the anxiety in her parents, for example, and all of the older people. They are very, very worried for their young folk. Just please be normal, please fit in. That's the way, that's the only way you can get a life together. And I think this violence in society kind of forms the distant heartbeat, maybe is what creates the violence in the boy.
I love that you highlight the societal aspects. Because when I read a story, I'm looking for character, and Sohail's story is people by what might be better termed as types, rather than characters. We're introduced to the boy, the girl, the father, the hairdresser, and so on. And I felt this lack of character in terms of engagement. I found it distracting to have the father's unspoken words later spoken by the girl, for example. So I had to adjust as a reader to what the story seemed to want of me. And I see that Sohail's approach enables greater focus on the network and dynamics that bind the individual's society, as you so rightly say. Did you feel the story asking you to change at all as a reader?
With the use of the description of the characters as the boy, the girl, to be honest, I'm probably not a very good reader in that I didn't really notice it first time round. And it was only really when I was reading a story again for this podcast that I kind of really noticed that. I think it shows the characters' roles in society. It shows what they are allotted, what they are allowed. And by describing them as ciphers, we're kind of encouraged to go along with the orthodoxy of these typical relationships. And I wonder if it kind of makes us slightly complicit in these societal strata, in that we think, oh, the girl's got to be like this, the boy's got to be like this. And it shows us ourselves a little bit. And I think also by never mentioning her name, always calling her the girl, I found that really, really moving when she died, I think towards the end of old age, I imagined. And it captured much more the sadness of all her love and passion and spirit of her as once a young girl, much more than the description of an old woman died, because society tells us it's like, oh yeah, old women died. It's less of an emotional wrench as it is as the girl died, because we are all girls and boys, we are all our youths. And I think by Mahreen keeping with that, she finds new depths, new emotional elements.
I wondered about the family structure, in that at the beginning the mother is dying at 62, but her son is 19 and no other children are mentioned. This seems quite unusual, given that it's emphasised in the story that young people of 18 and 19 are already set on marriage. And I wondered why it was necessary for the mother to be so much older.
Yeah, this is a good point. I didn't really think about this until you mentioned it, actually. I think there's a duality in the story between action and inaction. And I think maybe the older generation needed to be quite a bit older for them to be fully inactive, with the mother who is inactive because she's very ill, and the dad as well. They needed to be in a state that they were beyond it or past this action. They were very much more observers. There's a bit at the end where they're playing cards and they're not able to make their moves. She doesn't quite see her role, what it is she's got to do. And I think they have to be old, the parents have to be old, to really frame the younger generation as suddenly having agency and not knowing what to do with it.
The story presents a nuanced consideration of gender roles. Sohail seems to see females as being at the heart of the story. At one point in your interview with her, she describes the girl being the centre. Then later in the interview, she says the mother is the core of the story. But it seemed to me that the boy is at the heart because he owns the dramatic high point, this transgressive act of cutting his sleeping girlfriend's hair. And his action is also foreshadowed by the opening paragraph, where the boy denies the girl a say in what he does with his hair, only to later claim agency over her hair. And the girl says she doesn't want a youth that amounts to pictures of herself with hair at differing lengths, but that's how her life is summed up in the remainder of the story. So I suppose this relates to these questions of agency that you highlighted. But whose story is this for you?
Probably the right answer might be it's the interaction of all of them. But for me, emotionally, I feel a great connection with the girl. I think she's the protagonist. I think the boy has great agency, but I feel he's the antagonist. After he's cut her hair, he has this sort of moment of coolly assessing what he's done. And there I feel he's like a Richard III or Macbeth or like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, where he's noticing that he is the hero in negative. He is the parody of the hero. He's not able to be the person he thought he was going to be. He thought he was going to be brave and noble in the face of his mum's illness. And actually, he's not. He's violent and bitter and resentful. And where the archetypal hero, the story is their journey towards them becoming themselves. He starts off trying to do something for his mum, which is his mum doesn't really want, and then gets further and further away from himself. Whereas I feel the girl starts off trying to please the boy, which falls horribly on its face. And then she kind of becomes herself more and more. I think the description of her at the end is that she's transcended their relationship. She gets married, she gets divorced, she becomes increasingly herself. The description of other elements fall away and it sort of becomes about her life. So I think for me, it's the girl. Also, as I read this in 2024 and I'm aware more and more of just the ubiquity of violence against women, I feel it's a society story as well.
Great answer. That it is fascinating, that shift in focus. And I agree that the boy is something of a tragic figure. I love the way the story kind of put him aside. It's a very unusual approach. I love being made party to the editing process through your interview with Sohail, and she generously mentions feedback from her editor at Granta, Rana Dasgupta, who said, "You described the woman's life as getting married, giving birth and dying. Is that all you want her life to be?" And Sohail points out that for a lot of people, that is their life. And this really resonated with me. And Sohail stood by her choice and acted on the feedback by trying to broaden her story. So we have this lyric ending that lifts to the mountains and the horizon, calling to women generally. Short stories often focus on little lives, but Sohail's approach, focusing on this broadening out rather than deepening into character, seems audacious. How did the ending work on you? What did it make you feel?
I felt very strong emotion, probably nothing I could put into words because it's such a melding of responses to it. But I think it was because of the ending that I was so taken by the story and I was really, really keen to publish it. The opening has this fantastic, this piquant irony, but Mahreen doesn't really just stay orbiting that. She barrels on and sort of takes the story further and let the story take its own shape. There's this quote from George Saunders, I'm going to butcher it, something along the lines of, "It's these deep, mysterious questions in life that do not get resolved in the same terms with which their question was posed." And Mahreen doesn't linger on the elements that she first draws together. She goes on beyond them, full of great inspiration. So I think it's the ending where she's just a million miles away from the opening which is so powerful in the short story, is that we just get what's important, and anything that isn't absolutely vital is just not included. And so therefore we're exhilarated by the intensity, which is sort of to go back to what we were saying before.
I was aware in Sohail's story that I couldn't picture the individuals, and some of the similes didn't conjure images for me. I can't see a face that resembles a scissor, for example. And in your interview with Sohail, you mentioned how prose can sink thoughtlessly into using techniques from cinema. And Sohail agrees that she prefers a non-cinematic approach. And cinema teaches me so much about story. And as a writer, I actively seek techniques to borrow from cinema. I think poetry and cinema have a lot to say to short fiction. I'd love to hear more about your views on prose in short fiction and the art of cinema.
So, no, I think you're right. And I've spent a lot of time on tubes recently looking over people's phones as they will watch a film or some sort of Netflix show. And there's so many visual cliches out there. I will look over someone's shoulder and very, very quickly, I will recognize a shot, not from something I've watched, but just from the fact that so many scenes are scenes that we have seen before. And it's coincidentally, I think, recently, really this year, I've tried to seek out other ways of watching. And, this is probably very stereotypical stuff, but like an early Fellini film, La Strada, or a brilliant Vittorio De Sica film called Miracle in Milan. And also things like Merchant Ivory's first film, Shakespeare Waller. I feel I've learned so much about storytelling from these. For example, that Shakespeare Waller, I don't think I knew just how delicately these almost invisible gossamer threads can hold a story. You can really sort of just respond to the story so beautifully and intimately. And I don't think I kind of got that until I'd really watched this film. And so I think there's a lot that could be got from cinema. I know Camilla Grudova talks about Pasolini a lot, and I want to talk to her more about that, because I think that would be rather exciting sort of energy to have in your stories.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes. So would you like to tell us a little about other Scratchbooks projects, current or forthcoming?
We're bringing out Duets on October the 17th. And that's a really, really interesting book to have been part of. It is a collection of short stories, each one written as if woven back and forth between two writers. And it's made for really such exciting, energetic stories. I think if I was a writer in those situations, I don't know how you get anything out, because you're handing over your control of a story to someone else who would probably take it in a very different direction from where you wanted to. So I wanted to create a book of short stories that kind of spoke a little to the reverse engineering series, in that the craft is very much on the outside. You can see the drama of a writer taking a handbrake turn that the other writer maybe hadn't seen and would have to respond to. And you see some writers who are very, very fantastic at working together. And there's other writers who are dropping bombs for each other. It's been fantastic to work on. We have Ellie Williams writing with her wife, Nell Stevens, John McGregor writing with Gurnik Johal, Anna Wood writing with Ruby Cowling, Ben Pester with Tim McGavin, David Rose writing with Rolf Bakker, Zoe Gilbert writing with Jared McGuinness.
Sounds absolutely fantastic. I mean, so literally one writer would start and then send the beginning to another writer who would continue. Is that how it works?
That was my original brief to them, but they went in very different directions from it. For example, Anna Wood and Ruby Cowling took a Borges story and just started replacing words with their own words, which was very exciting. Gurnik Johal and John McGregor, you can't tell whose story's whose, because they kept flipping and writing the other person's stories. It's been truly magnificent.
Okay, fantastic. Well, that's wonderful, Tom. It's been a delight to talk to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Tom Conaghan, editor of Scratchbooks, which are beautiful books in both production and content. Do read them and do check out the website at www.scratchbooks.co.uk. Thank you for listening to this Small Pleasures podcast, and do keep your eyes and ears open for our next. Watch this space. We have many great short stories to cover. Until then, goodbye from me and from Sonya.
À très bientôt.